It was exactly 4 o'clock in the morning when the pounding started. Not a polite knock, not even an impatient ring of the bell, but full fists hammering my door with the ferocity of someone who thought they were raiding a criminal hideout. At first I thought I was dreaming, that the muffled yells were some echo from a nightmare. But when the pounding came again, shaking the doorframe, and a shrill voice cut through the quiet like glass, adrenaline surged me wide awake. My heart hammered out of rhythm as I stumbled to my feet, pulling a jacket over my shoulders, fumbling toward the blinds to see what kind of emergency had descended on my porch. What I saw hit me with such disbelief that for a moment I wondered if I had finally gone insane. There was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, dressed like royalty for an occasion no one had invited me to. With her stood two overdressed guests in cocktail attire, one clutching a sequined clutch bag, the other still nursing half a glass of wine, both looking absurdly out of place in the cold, pre-dawn dark. And Karen, of course, was screeching, her voice so high and sharp it seemed to peel the silence off the street. She was jabbing her finger toward my Jeep as if it were some grotesque hazard, shrieking accusations that it was blocking important community event parking, and that as an HOA member she had full authority to reassign my driveway. Before I could even finish rubbing the blur from my eyes, red and blue lights flashed at the corner. The distinctive bounce of a cruiser echoed off windows as it rolled to the curb, summoned apparently by Karen's midnight 911 call, because of course she had escalated this into an emergency. Neighbors' lights began clicking on, curtains twitched, doors cracked open, pajama-clad faces emerged from porches to witness the circus. My sleepy street, normally so still you could hear leaves shiver, was suddenly thick with chaos because Karen wanted my Jeep moved. I opened the door, greeted not with good morning or any sense of decorum but an overpowering cloud of perfume and Karen's voice barreling into my skull. There he is. This is the man blocking community access. Officer, you need to make him move it. She spoke the way a queen might announce a criminal's guilt before trial, confident, arrogant, positively vibrating off imagined authority. The guests behind her shuffled, shifting uncomfortably, one avoiding eye contact as though embarrassed to be part of the act but too spineless to leave. I blinked at all three of them, still trying to process the absurdity of being pulled from bed to defend my right to park in my own damn driveway. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, posture heavy with fatigue, eyes weary, like a man who had seen too many pointless calls at too many ridiculous hours. He looked at Karen, then at me, then at the Jeep parked squarely in my driveway like it had all the right in the world, as because it did. He asked plainly, "Is that your vehicle, sir?" When I confirmed, he tilted his head, lips tightening with the faintest smirk, a half-hidden acknowledgement that he knew exactly how ridiculous this all was. Karen, however, was determined to turn it into a production. She launched into a speech, her arms flapping, her voice rising. "Officer, my guests are important people. Influential. They cannot be forced to walk from down the street like common pedestrians. As HOA authority, I am empowered to reassign parking when an event demands it. His refusal is selfish and disruptive. It's a neighborhood disturbance." My lips tugged into an involuntary laugh, not the uproarious kind, but the groggy, ironic chuckle of someone too tired to scream at the insanity of it all. The officer's brows lifted at Karen's rant. He sighed, pinched the bridge of his nose, and asked her, voice flat, where the violation was she kept shrieking about. She spun, nails flashing under the streetlights, pointing dramatically at my Jeep, which gleamed quietly like an obedient dog chained neatly in its yard. The absurdity was almost beautiful in its simplicity, a metallic statue of compliance being accused of criminal defiance. Karen's voice only climbed higher, shriller, more urgent with every syllable. Neighbors were fully awake now, wrapped in robes and blankets, arms folded against the pre-dawn chill, gripping mugs of coffee they'd rushed to brew once the commotion rattled them from their beds. Some filmed openly with their phones. Others whispered, their shoulders trembling with suppressed laughter. The kind of laughter that only comes when you realize the neighborhood tyrant has finally overplayed her hand in spectacular fashion. Karen doubled down, accusing me of sabotage, of intentionally humiliating her, of refusing to comply with HOA bylaws that, according to her, meant that my driveway was technically community access, because it was paved and visible from the street. She stamped her heel on the asphalt, swore her guests' rights overrode mine, and declared the spirit of the community superseded ownership. By now, the officer was losing patience. He looked at her steadily and said in measured, deliberate words, "Ma'am, private driveways are not community property. He can park his vehicle where he pleases. This is not a police matter." It was as if he had just committed treason against her kingdom. She gasped audibly, clutching at her pearls, or rather the gaudy necklace strung around her throat, eyes bulging with the fury of a monarch denied. She swore she would escalate this to the highest HOA office, as if the HOA board were the Supreme Court. The officer shook his head, scribbled something into his notepad, and warned her in calm but sharp tones that calling 911 over a parking spat was an abuse of emergency services that could cross the line into criminal misuse. He slid his pad back into his pocket, shot me a thin look of sympathy, then stepped back into his cruiser. The lights cut away, leaving behind the harsh glare of the streetlights, the silence of stunned neighbors, and a woman vibrating in the center of it all, her fury desperate to find a target. As soon as the cruiser rolled away, leaving nothing but the groan of tires against asphalt, Karen turned her venom back to me. Her perfume clung sickly in the air as she leaned close enough for her words to strike like darts. "This is only the beginning," she hissed before whipping around and scowling at her guests. One of them, finally bold enough to speak, muttered something about how they could have just parked down the street or taken a rideshare. She silenced him with a glare sharp enough to pierce steel. Then, with a dramatic tug of her scarf, she marched back toward her glowing house, dragging her entourage along like prisoners trailing after their warden. Neighbors chuckled softly into sleeves. Someone clapped once for effect. I closed my door, every nerve buzzing, relief mixing with tension, unable to quiet the coil in my chest. I leaned back against the wood, breath heavy, and realized this absurd invasion at 4 a.m. wasn't a one-off. It was declaration. A battlefield had been chosen whether I liked it or not, and the battlefield was my driveway. My Jeep became more than a car that morning. It became a flag planted squarely in contested territory. Karen wasn't coming at me with reason, with fairness, with arguments, but with control, sharp and shrill and boundless. And I knew without question that she wasn't going to let this go. Her pride had been pierced in front of the whole community. Pride like hers doesn't deflate. It detonates. I glanced out the window once more before heading back to bed, and there sat my Jeep. Quiet, immovable, loyal, a soldier ready for the next fight it hadn't asked for. By sunrise, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. Word raced faster than the first garbage truck rumbling down the street. Yes, Karen had called 911 at 4 a.m. over a Jeep in a private driveway. Yes, the cop had scolded her, dismissed her. Yes, half the neighborhood had stood in robes watching the meltdown while she screeched her authority into the dark. By the time I stepped outside with a fresh cup of coffee, neighbors lingered with amused smirks or subtle nervous looks. Some laughed openly, already ridiculing her online. Others muttered warnings, lowering their voices like conspiracy theorists. She won't let this slide. She'll call a board meeting. She's already planning. And they were right, because by that afternoon, taped crooked on my door by hands far too familiar, was a notice from the HOA. An emergency hearing had been called, requiring my attendance to address disturbances, non-compliance with community standards, and parking issues. My hand shook with laughter and dread as I peeled it off, the absurdity vibrating off the page like static. She had managed to turn my driveway, my Jeep sitting like a sentinel in its corner, into a municipal crisis. And I knew as I read it that the quiet wasn't calm at all. It was the inhale before another scream, the tightening before another blow. Karen had been humiliated at 4 a.m. by police, and humiliation was the one injury she could never forgive. The HOA clubhouse was waiting that night. The board was in her pocket. Neighbors were restless. The war was no longer just whispered. It was scheduled. It had an agenda. Picking sides had begun. The notice on my door flapped in the wind like a flag of war. Its corners curled and tape residue smeared as if Karen had wanted not just to announce it, but to stick it there as a brand. a mark of her supposed authority. I held it in my hand, reading the absurd lines about disturbances and failure to comply with community standards, and I almost laughed. But beneath the humor was a thrum of anger, because this was no longer just a noisy 4 a.m. quarrel outside my front door. This was official now, stamped with HOA language, twisted through her interpretation, turned into a trial. She had dragged the board into it because she didn't get the victory she wanted from the officer that morning. If the law wouldn't give her the power she demanded, she was determined to twist neighborhood politics until she got it anyway. As the day bled on, I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this would blow over once the board realized how ridiculous it all was. But by evening, the neighborhood practically vibrated with anticipation. Cars filled the clubhouse parking lot earlier than usual. People spilled onto sidewalks, and there was an energy in the air, not excitement exactly, but a kind of gossipy electricity, the kind that makes every mundane face look like a spectator showing up early for a fight. When I walked there carrying my old HOA binder under my arm, the one stuffed with every ridiculous bylaw from fence heights to mailbox shades, people turned their heads, some whispering, some sighing with relief, others clearly cautious and eager to see the spectacle play out. Inside, the clubhouse chairs had been dragged into rows like courtroom benches, neighbors clustering in little knots sipping from styrofoam cups of coffee, their faces a theater of curiosity and quiet dread. And at the front table, elevated just slightly, sat Karen like a monarch in exile returned to demand her throne, flanked by 2 board members who looked stiff and polite, but clearly uncomfortable. She wore that smug smile, the one that stretched too far at the edges, the one meant to say, "This is already over, I've won." She wanted the room to think that I was simply walking into sentencing. The HOA president, poor Charles, a man with drooping shoulders that looked weighed down by years of other people's nonsense, banged his little gavel on the table as though that would restore order to what was already chaos wearing community clothes. He cleared his throat, recited the boilerplate about standards and harmony, then stated that the matter at hand was my alleged violation of parking regulation after repeated disturbances. Repeated. My blood ticked hotter at the choice of word, because the only disturbance had been Karen shrieking at my door at 4 a.m, and her 911 call that dragged cops onto my property. But she had rewritten the narrative like she always did. In her story, I wasn't the neighbor just trying to sleep. No, I was the criminal, the agitator blocking progress, sabotaging events, spreading disharmony through selfish obstinance. And then she rose. Clipboard clutched in one hand like a Bible, papers clutched in the other like evidence of sin. She launched into speech, a performance she had clearly been rehearsing since before dawn. She described herself not as the aggressor but the victim, boldly painting me as hostile, unwilling to cooperate with the spirit of community. She stood tall, flinging her arms outward, claiming she had important guests who were humiliated when I refused to sacrifice an inch of driveway space. She rattled on about traditions of hospitality, about harmony being broken, about how my refusal amounted to a direct attack on the HOA's core principles. Her guests nodded furiously in the front row, their wine-soaked loyalty written across their stiff faces, pretending to buy into the ridiculous theater. Others sat clustered, whispering to each other with raised eyebrows as if to say, "Does she actually believe this?" But Karen didn't look at them. She looked at me, her voice climbing octaves, her finger stabbing the air like she was pointing out a defendant to a jury of frightened peasants. I didn't rise. I didn't flinch. I let her rant because I knew 2 things. First, that overconfidence was always her undoing, and second, nothing undercut her more than patience. When she finally ran out of breath, when her papers fluttered uselessly in her hands, and when even her closest allies looked bored and restless under the tidal wave of her self-righteousness, Charles turned to me with weary eyes and asked quietly, "Do you have anything to say in response?" I stood then, calm, deliberate, laying my binder flat on the table like a mechanic placing down tools he already knew would fix the engine. I flipped the pages, highlighted sections glowing under the fluorescent light. I spoke in measured tones. Driveways are private property. The bylaws explicitly exempt them from shared easement responsibilities. Nowhere in the entire binder could you find even a whisper about HOA members being allowed to commandeer another person's driveway. No matter the event, no matter the so-called emergency. I turned the book toward the board, sliding it closer, tapping the underlined lines I had prepared. They leaned forward, reading. The room leaning with them, murmurs flowing like ripples across still water. Neighbors craned their necks to glimpse, whispering, pointing. I could feel the tide shifting in the weight of the room. Karen's smile cracked then. Just a hairline fracture at first, twitching at the corners of her mouth. She interrupted, shrieking that I was twisting words, hiding behind technicalities. That the board must understand the spirit, not the letter of the law. But the words fell flat, a desperate plea against printed ink that was undeniable. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let frustration slip into my speech. I simply repeated what the bylaws said again and again, until it struck home like nails hammered into wood. And then something miraculous happened. From the middle rows, a quiet voice spoke. Greg, the soft-spoken man from 2 streets over, the kind of neighbor who rarely spoke at all, stood. He cleared his throat. His voice shook at first, but then steadied with conviction. He said that Karen had done the same thing to him, accused him of violating HOA rules when he parked his truck in his own driveway because she considered it unsightly. He recounted how she had filed complaints about him leaving his recyclables out an hour too long, how she had written him warning letters about mowing schedules. His words cracked the dam wide. Other voices followed. A mother spoke about the letter Karen left complaining about her kid's jump rope making too much sidewalk noise. An old man snorted that Karen had once fined him $50 because his mailbox paint had faded a shade. One by one, people began rising, their words pouring into the clubhouse, each testimony building on the last until Karen's reign of petty control lay crumbling from the sheer weight of dissent. Karen tried to shout them down, her voice skyrocketing past reason as she waved her arms, jabbing fingers at me, at Greg, at the audience, screaming that this was all orchestrated slander. But her voice was drowned under the accumulated noise of the community finally speaking out loud what had festered quietly for years. Charles banged the gavel, pleading for order, but the gavel sounded like punctuation fuel for a story that had been waiting too long to be told. And then it was clear. This wasn't my trial anymore. It was hers. She had come in to strip me of dignity, but she had summoned too many witnesses who had suffered under the same reign. The board saw it. Their faces said it all, embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably from under her glare. Finally, Charles, with his tired voice, declared the matter settled, that no violation had been found. The private driveways were not subject to HOA claims. And that was the end of it. His words sliced through the chaos, silencing even Karen as she stood stiff with rage. She stormed out in a blur of perfume and muttered threats, her high heels cracking on tile, clipboard clutched like a wounded shield. Her guests shuffled awkwardly behind, avoiding our eyes, their loyalty drained by the flood of voices against her. The door slammed tight. When I stepped out into the night air, whispers turned into greetings, pats of encouragement, hands squeezing my shoulder. Some thanked me outright for standing, for showing the board what they had long known but never proved, that Karen's authority was built on fear and fiction. Others warned me it wasn't over, not by a mile. They were right, of course. Humiliation doesn't end wars like this. It fuels them. Karen had tasted resentment like acid, and I knew she'd be plotting already behind those carefully drawn blinds across the street. I walked home with my binder under my arm, lighter but wary, the cool night cutting fresh across my skin. My Jeep waited, parked steady in the driveway, its hulking silhouette under the glow of the street lamp a quiet reassurance that truth had carried me through this round. But as I climbed my porch and leaned into the chair I kept beside the door, I smiled a tired smile. I hadn't asked for this fight, but I was in it now. And Karen, wounded and red-faced somewhere across the road, wasn't going to surrender. She was going to escalate. She always did. And my driveway, still occupied by my Jeep, still guarded by the law she couldn't bend, had become the arena. The fallout from the HOA meeting lingered like smoke after a fire. The air in the neighborhood had changed, but instead of clearing, it simmered thick with tension. Karen had walked out red-faced, muttering threats beneath her breath, and everyone knew humiliation would only make her sharper, not quieter. I expected a storm, and sure enough, it didn't take long for the paper war to begin. The first shot came in the form of a bright orange envelope stuck to my front door one weekday morning. Stamped with the HOA insignia, it screamed violation in tall block letters, almost like it was trying to scare me before I even read it. I peeled it off, tore it open, and nearly laughed out loud at what was inside. It claimed that my Jeep had been parked in the same position for over 72 hours without movement, which, According to the note, violated community standards for vehicle circulation. Vehicle circulation. I flipped open the bylaws binder I had now practically memorized, and there was not one line in the hundreds of pages that mentioned such nonsense. Karen had invented an offense out of thin air, hoping to bury me in hassle and paperwork. I snapped photos of the page, wrote a formal response, and attached my own scanned copies of the parking section of the bylaws with highlights where the words private property appeared. Within hours, the HOA president called me with a tired tone, admitting there was no such rule and the complaint would be dismissed. I thanked him, but I knew perfectly well who was behind it. 2 days later, another envelope. This one claimed my Jeep's tires had left faint, unsightly marks on the driveway concrete that affected the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. My Jeep just sitting in my driveway where it belonged was now an aesthetic crime. This time I didn't even bother getting angry. I just filed the paper away in a folder I had started keeping specifically for Karen's antics. I labeled it Karen's Greatest Hits and slid it into my drawer like a personal museum of absurdity. It became clear what she was doing. She wasn't trying to win outright. She was trying to grind me down. Death by paper cuts. File enough complaints, bury me under enough notices, drain me with questions and meetings until I snapped. The problem for her was that I had already survived real storms in life, and if all she had were sharp pieces of paper and empty threats, she was going to lose this war. So I fought strategy with strategy. I went out and upgraded my cameras. Not cheap little doorbell ones either. High-definition security cameras, 4 of them, fixed on the corners of my property with motion sensors that lit up the second anyone came near. Their red glow blinked with authority, recording every inch of my driveway and yard. The first night after I installed them, I caught her. Around midnight, as the street lay quiet and the rhythm of crickets filled the air, one of the feeds pinged my phone. I opened it half asleep, and there she was. Karen marching across the street in a hoodie, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, pacing along the very edge of my lawn like some prowling inspector. She paused now and then, sweeping her light across the grass, jotting something onto her clipboard, as if she were going to conjure a new violation out of fallen leaves. At one point, she stared directly at the lens, noticed the faint red light blinking at her, and stiffened. She yanked her hood further down, then hurried back across the road. I watched it with a mix of anger and amusement, then downloaded the video file immediately, storing it in my folder. The file name? Karen Midnight Patrol. Her obsession was escalating, and she was clearly growing more reckless because the next week I got another knock on my door. It wasn't Karen this time. It was the police. The same weary sheriff from the driveway fiasco showed up in broad daylight, clipboard in hand, irritation carved into his face. He told me Karen had filed multiple noise complaints about my Jeep being excessively loud whenever I started it. Noise complaints against a parked car in a private driveway. I pointed toward my Jeep, sitting politely as always, and invited him to hear it himself. I slid into the seat, turned the key, and the engine purred like it had been tuned yesterday. Smooth, quiet, functional. The sheriff folded his arms, exhaling through his nose with a kind of dry resignation. "Sir, nothing's wrong here," he said plainly. Then his tone dropped darker. "But I'll give you this on the record. If she keeps filing false reports like this, you can pursue harassment charges. She's crossing lines." I nodded, thanked him, and watched him drive off. For the first time, I realized Karen wasn't just making herself look foolish. She was teetering dangerously close to real consequences. But humiliation and warnings had never stopped her before. When people get desperate, they turn to different battlefields. Karen's new one was digital, or rather, the HOA message board. That poisonous forum lit up. The same week with Karen's posts about certain residents disrupting harmony with selfish parking practices and vehicles hogging driveways in a way harmful to community image. She never used my name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. The responses told the real story. A few of her lame loyalists posted fake sympathy emojis or muttered half-hearted agreements, but most neighbors clapped back. Some outright mocked her. Others posted memes. One person uploaded a photo of a padlock slapped onto a Jeep wheel with the caption "Driveway, Karen." Another posted the video clip of her shrieking in the street at 4 a.m. during the original police call. The nickname stuck. "Driveway Karen." People started whispering it in passing, sometimes loud enough for her to hear. Kids on bikes rode past her house chanting it. She glared so hard at them one afternoon that they pedaled away laughing, shaking their heads like they had just encountered a comic villain. But even memes and laughter weren't enough to slow her brewing storm. The paper complaints kept coming. Another notice about garden weeds that apparently spread unsightly visual contrast from my lawn toward the street. Yet another about potential oil stains under my Jeep that didn't even exist. Each one went into my folder, each one laughed at, documented, responded to, and dismissed. And each one ratcheted the tension further. It all boiled into another morning when I walked outside with my dog and saw Karen in my yard, with 3 of her dinner guests. No less than clipboard still clutched like it was some badge of authority. They were bending over, pointing dramatically near the Jeep, speaking in hushed, scandalized tones. When I approached calmly and asked them what they were doing on my property, Karen flared with that saccharine venom of hers. We're inspecting potential oil leaks that might damage community aesthetics. She said it with such seriousness I almost burst out laughing in her face. Instead, I just pulled out my phone, waved the live camera feed at her, showing her and her guests trespassing. Their faces dropped. The guests shifted away awkwardly, muttering excuses. Her fake authority dissolved in the harsh daylight of video evidence. She tried to claw it back, snapping at me and declaring that filming her was illegal. I told her the truth flatly. These were my cameras on my land pointing at my driveway, and I was perfectly within my rights. That shook her, but not enough to stop her. She hissed, "You won't get away with embarrassing me a second time," before storming away. By then, the amusement was almost outweighing the frustration. Neighbors had begun to enjoy the spectacle almost as theater. People taking evening walks slowed in front of my place just in case Karen showed up to throw her latest tantrum. They traded stories in whispers about her endless complaints, laughing about how desperate she had become. Someone even printed a meme of her face superimposed over a street sign reading, "No parking except Karen's friends." It spread around quietly, popping up in text groups and private chats, fueling chuckles across the block. But the more comic it became, the more dangerous I knew it was under the surface. Because Karen wasn't just angry anymore, she was cornered. And every time someone mocked her online, every time she lost credibility at a board meeting, every noise complaint dismissed, every video clip of her screaming circulated, her pride took deeper wounds. Pride like hers doesn't heal. It festers. And festering pride doesn't slip into silence, it lashes out waiting for the perfect moment. So I doubled my defenses. Cameras, sensors, floodlights, every inch of driveway watched, every corner documented, every violation note carefully stored. I wasn't just fighting Karen's lies anymore. I was building a case brick by brick, stronger than her pride could ever be. And deep in her dark house behind those always closed blinds, I knew she was planning whatever escalation came next. Something bigger. Something louder. Something more absurd. Because paper cuts only work as long as the target bleeds. And standing in my yard, binder in one hand, fresh coffee in the other, the Jeep gleaming steady behind me, I knew I wasn't bleeding. I was waiting. And Karen hated nothing more than a man too calm to break. It was a Saturday evening when the neighborhood felt like it was humming with something just beneath the surface. Lawnmowers were finally quiet. Kids had been called in from their games, and most houses glowed with the normal warmth of dinner hours. But across the street at Karen's, the night was transforming into something else entirely. From late afternoon, I had seen cars begin to trickle in, headlights bouncing along the curb, shiny sedans and SUVs sliding into every open stretch of asphalt as if the block was a valet lot. Music thudded faintly, the kind of bass that carries through walls, and laughter and shouting spilled into the street as though order itself had been revoked. Strings of cheap glowing lights were draped across her lawn, flickering like she was throwing a carnival, and in the middle of it all strutted Karen herself in a shimmering sequined dress. Hair pulled tight, clutching her clipboard like it was a crown. I watched from my porch, leaning against the rail with my arms crossed, sipping a soda. The Jeep sat immovable in my driveway, glinting confidently under the fading daylight. As more and more cars lined the block, awkwardly double-parked, some pressing up against mailboxes, others strangling curbs until neighbors were muttering already about being blocked in, I knew what was coming. Rumors had drifted all week on the neighborhood site about Karen's annual HOA party, an event she bragged about as though it were a state fair, a chance for her to show off her pull. I had also heard, more importantly, that she was telling her guests they'd be able to park in my driveway. Which is why earlier that morning I had taken a quiet trip to the hardware store and installed something new, 3 steel bollards, bright and heavy, that locked firmly into the concrete at the mouth of my drive, strong enough to stop a car. They weren't permanent nor removable posts, but to the casual eye it looked like a fortress. When the second or third wave of guests arrived, one of them tried to nose his shiny car onto my property, headlights flashing across my Jeep like an intruder's torch. I stepped forward slowly, perfectly calm, and waved him off, guiding him back down with a polite smile. "Private property," I mouthed through his glass. He flushed, reversed hard, spun off awkwardly until his tires squealed. Other guests muttered to each other. Karen caught all of it. From her lawn, her sequins catching the glow, she twisted around and glared at me so hard it could have cut glass. That was round 1. As the sun dipped past the rooftops, her party swelled into chaos. Dozens of people milled across her lawn with cocktails, dressed like they had come from a hotel ballroom rather than a suburban cul-de-sac. The bass rattled. Her voice screeched orders above it, waving her arms like she was commanding troops. Slowly, the street jammed tight with chrome and steel, cars stacked against each other. A horn blared as one neighbor tried to pull out and found himself trapped in. I could hear people arguing already about where to put the next car. Karen, undeterred, strutted down the curb, gesturing as if she owned it all. And finally she made her move. Dragging 2 of her guests like loyal guards, she marched across toward my bollards, heels stabbing at the sidewalk until they clicked loudly. She demanded, finger stabbing at the air. "Remove those immediately. This is a community event, and your obstruction is sabotaging us." Her guests stood by with embarrassment twisted across their faces, one mumbling that maybe they should find another spot. Karen snapped at them, shoving them behind her like pawns. I didn't flinch. I simply shook my head and reminded her for perhaps the 100th time. Driveway is mine. Private property. HOA already ruled. Then I tilted my head toward the cameras bolted firmly on my house, their little red lights blinking in plain view. "And they're recording all of this." Her face flushed crimson, her voice skipping into shrill desperation. "This is a sanctioned neighborhood event. You're ruining harmony," she screamed and turned back toward her guests like she needed them to applaud. They didn't. One of them muttered audibly enough for me to catch it. "This is insane." She glared knives at him until he bit his lip and fell silent. By then, the crowd had started to spill further down the street. It didn't take long for real trouble to arrive. A towing company, lights blinking like a carnival ride, clattering chains pulling heavy across asphalt. Someone had called because Karen's guests had blocked a hydrant, a mailbox, even a driveway or 2. The rumble of the tow truck rolling in was a spark against gasoline. Partygoers shouted, voices rose, arguments broke. People scrambled to repark cars in the chaos, but 3 didn't move fast enough. We all watched as expensive machines were hooked. Chains tightening, lifted on winches and rolled steadily away. Voices shrieked into the humid night. Karen at the middle of it all, shrieking orders, shrieking threats, shrieking at me as though I had personally orchestrated it. I leaned on my fence post, soda bottle sweating in my hand, smiling faintly as if I had front row tickets to a play. Neighbors had left their porches by now, some clapping with amusement, some recording, some whispering happily to each other. The same woman who had barked countless violation notices at them was unraveling in sequins like a madwoman. At one point, she stormed toward me, her finger stabbing into the air like a weapon, screaming that I had conspired against her. But in her blind fury, she slipped on the edge of the curb, her heel catching. She stumbled wildly, teetering, nearly crashing before catching herself, one arm flailing, and the street erupted. Laughter, real, unrestrained, deep laughter carried by dozens of throats. It was the loudest roar of the night. Her cheeks burned so red I could see it through sequins and neon light, and still she tried to straighten with dignity, clutching her clipboard like a gavel. But the spell was broken. Whatever control she once had rested dying in the open air. Her guests grew restless. Conversations carried sharper edges now, voices complaining loudly about never again. Cars reversed rough against engines. Even her allies looked sour. The event she had promised as her triumphant return of influence now looked more like a carnival fire spiraling down. "You will regret this," she shrieked at me over the laughter, her voice cracking. But no one clapped anymore. No one supported her. Even her own supporters couldn't mask their embarrassment. Finally, as the tow truck dragged the last car away, the music sputtered into silence. Cheap lights still flickered across her yard, but no one danced under them. No one toasted beside them. Guests trickled off into the night one by one, shoulders slumped, voices sharp with irritation. By the time silence returned to the street, Karen stood alone in sequins on her lawn, her face twisted, clipboard shaking in her fist, glaring at me like a general who had just watched her army scatter. I leaned casually against my Jeep, still parked safely behind those steel bollards. Camera light blinking softly above me, neighbors chuckling behind blinds and across porches. And for once, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm. Her power was gone. Not permanent, not yet. Pride like hers never dies at once. But she had just suffered her loudest defeat. And defeats like that stick. This wasn't the last round, no. But tonight the neighborhood had seen behind her curtain. And for the first time, the queen of pettiness looked like the fool at her own coronation. For weeks, the street had felt like a stage where Karen rehearsed her madness, storming with clipboard in hand, shrieking threats of lawsuits, posting flyers in people's mailboxes. Each attempt collapsed under the weight of evidence. Each lie, cut down by the simple fact that my Jeep was on my driveway, and no bylaw in existence could ever change that. But Karen wasn't wired for surrender. Every humiliation only seemed to twist deeper into her pride, and I could see it in her eyes as she paced behind her blinds. She had nothing left, no sympathy, no allies, not even the HOA board to rubber stamp her complaints. But people like her don't vanish. They explode. I knew it was only a matter of time before she struck one last time with the kind of reckless desperation that can burn down everything around it. The envelope came first, thick, stamped with legal markings, and slid into my box like some poisoned gift. I carried it into my kitchen, sliced it open, and felt the absurdity spill into my hands. Karen had filed an actual lawsuit accusing me of violating HOA easement rights and obstructing community harmony. She claimed that by parking my Jeep and reinforcing my driveway with bollards, I had infringed on communal space and caused emotional distress to her and her guests. Emotional distress over a driveway. It read like parody, but the court seal made it real. I laughed once before the bile rose in my throat. I had to prepare, not just for her circus, but for the exhausting reality of dragging this into a courtroom. The days leading up to the hearing blurred into a montage of preparation. I combed through every clause of the HOA binder, highlighting lines that screamed in defiance of her fantasy. Driveways were private property. Easements applied to sidewalks and shared lots, not homes. I pulled footage from my cameras, video of her trespassing at night with a flashlight, screaming at me across the street, pounding on my door at 4 a.m. I spoke with neighbors who had grown brave enough to stand against her, and more than one promised they'd testify if needed. Greg in particular, the quiet man from 2 streets over, was ready to speak again. His patience had burned away after she harassed him for mowing his lawn at the wrong time of day. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse smelled of musty air and coffee. I walked through metal detectors with my binder under one arm like it was a shield forged out of paper and ink. She was already there, sitting with her lawyer at the plaintiff's table, dressed like she was on trial for Wall Street fraud instead of suburban pettiness. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, her hands stacked with papers spilling out of a folder too thick to be serious. Her lawyer looked miserable, flipping through pages with the exasperation of someone dragged into a battle he didn't believe in. She shot me a smile, triumphant as though the outcome was already written in stone. When her lawyer spoke, his words tumbled into vague accusations, easement misunderstandings, community disharmony, the idea that my barricades were hostile and divisive. He pointed to photos, glossy, blown-up pictures of my Jeep sitting in my driveway, as though the simple act of being there was damning. Karen nodded violently with every word, her eyes scanning the room for validation that wasn't coming. And then it was my turn. I rose slowly, binder under my arm, and spoke with the flat certainty of a man who had prepared too long to lose his composure. I flipped to the section highlighted in neon yellow, the page declaring without ambiguity: driveways are private property, excluded from shared community use. I handed the copies to the judge, watched his eyes glance down, watched the small nod that told me he understood instantly. I pulled out my flash drive, played video clips on the screen. Karen marching at midnight with her flashlight, scribbling notes she didn't have the right to write. Karen screaming at me in my Jeep while police told her to stop. Karen shrieking in sequins at her party while tow trucks dragged away her guests' illegally parked cars. The courtroom shifted as murmurs rose. Even people in the gallery turned to glance at her with disbelief etched on their faces. And then, like the hammer of closure, I called Greg. His voice was steady now, anger ironed flat into conviction. He told the judge how Karen had harassed him over trivialities, how she used rules as weapons, how she had turned community into her personal kingdom until the entire block bent under her weight. Another neighbor added their own testimony, each story stitching together the portrait of a woman who had mistaken entitlement for law. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice straining at the edges of hysteria, but the judge silenced her sharply. When it was over, his words carried enough weight to break an empire. This claim is dismissed as baseless and frivolous. Driveways are private property, and the defendant had every right to park his vehicle there. Further misuse of this court will result in sanctions. He leaned forward, pausing long enough for his voice to land like a blow. This court is not a stage for personal grudges. The gavel cracked the air. Karen's jaw tightened, her lips trembled, her face burned crimson. She had lost. Again. I walked out lighter than I had felt in months, neighbors patting me on the back as though I had won a battle for all of us. And yet, as I glanced back and watched Karen storm out behind me, her lawyer trailing like a hostage, I knew this wasn't the end. Her pride wouldn't allow it. She had been embarrassed in front of everyone, her last chance at authority stripped away. And humiliation for people like Karen isn't defeat, it's fuel. Sure enough, her revenge found new forms, new anonymous. Violation notices appeared in my mailbox, unsigned but dripping with perfume I recognized. Late at night, cars idled near my property long enough for my cameras to ping. And then the bombshell. The vacant lot beside her property suddenly had a for sale sign, and rumor spread that Karen was making an offer, her goal being to turn it into community overflow parking. My stomach turned cold at the thought of her planting her flag right beside my Jeep like a pirate claiming shoreline. I acted fast, pulling every string, every reserve, and I bought the lot myself before her offer could go through. When the deal closed in my name, I felt a rush of triumph stronger than any courtroom verdict. I walked the property line that night, deed tucked into my pocket, imagining the barriers I would build. Karen's rage was volcanic. She stormed across the street, demanding explanations, trembling with fury when I quietly unfolded the deed and showed her my name on it. My only words to her were simple. This is mine now. You'll never own me or this street. Her scream of frustration cut through the neighborhood, neighbors peeking through blinds to watch her shriek one more time in defeated rage. The fence rose first high and solid, cutting her gaze away until she couldn't spy on me from her windows. Then came the sprinklers, a motion-activated system I slyly installed along the border. Ostensibly, they were for lawn care, but when her guests tried cutting across my new property one evening for easy parking, they were blasted with cold, high pressure, water that sent children squealing and adults cursing as they scrambled back to the street, soaked and embarrassed. My cameras caught it all. That night, the clip passed from phone to phone through the neighborhood, then through online threads. Memes bloomed by dawn. Karen in scuba gear, Karen holding an umbrella, Karen floating in a raft outside my fence. For once, the whole neighborhood wasn't afraid of her. They were laughing. That laughter cracked her. She pounded on my door, soaking wet from her own run-in with the sprinklers, cheeks flushed, demanding I disable them because they were a personal attack. I showed her the deed calmly, explained the sprinklers were doing their job watering my lawn, and shut the door on her spluttering. Her shrieks echoed long into the night. The board dismissed her complaints. Her allies vanished. Each attempt to claw back authority only drowned her deeper. Within weeks, her crown had burned into dust. The finale came suddenly, not with another screech at my fence, but with the slow rumble of police cruisers pulling right in front of her house one evening. Officers stepped out, stern, carrying stacks of papers. Neighbors emerged with phones ready, whispering like they knew what was coming. Karen appeared at her door, waving her arms, papers in hand, screaming at them with all the fury she had left. But this time there was no tolerance. She was served, formally, citations for harassment, misuse of emergency services, falsified HOA notices. The board had voted to remove her presidency permanently, and with a restraining order wrapped neatly in the officer's hand, the empire she had built on fear and noise officially collapsed. The sight of her being escorted into a cruiser, still, shrieking about corruption, was so surreal I barely believed it. Neighbors applauded quietly, their sighs of relief carried through the warm air. After months of her theatrics, she was gone. Weeks later, a moving truck groaned at her curb. Furniture carried out piece by piece, her windows finally unshuttered for the last time. I sat on my porch watching the spectacle, the Jeep gleaming behind me, calm and immovable. Neighbors gathered, whispered, smiled. By sundown, the truck rolled away, and with it the last of her reign. The street was quiet again. Not tense quiet, but real quiet. Children played. Dogs barked. Laughter carried without fear of fines. At our impromptu celebration barbecue that weekend, someone brought a cake shaped like a Jeep. Everyone laughed until their sides hurt, and for the first time in months the community felt like a community, not a kingdom. Sitting there, soda fizzing in my hand, the sound of my neighbors finally free from her grip, I realized what the Jeep had become. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a flag, a monument, a symbol of defiance that refused to budge. And sometimes I thought, as Karen's old house sat empty across the street, that's all it takes to change everything. The decision not to move.